Hey guys, how you going? In this video, I want to talk about JavaScript arrow functions and how to actually use them, and more importantly, how they differ from standard JavaScript functions. So, to summarize, I'm going to be covering how they have a shorter, more concise syntax, and how there is major differences with the this keyword in the way where arrow functions do not have a this binding. And this is probably the main difference between arrow functions and standard functions. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about how arrow functions don't actually have an argument object, but there is actually a nice alternative. Okay, so let's go inside the text editor right here, and we can begin by actually writing out an example of an arrow function. So the way you define an arrow function is just like this. For example, I'm going to say const arrowfunc is equal to, and then we can define the arrow function. So for example, I can put parentheses like this, then equals greater than, then curly braces like this, and that is done. So this right here is an example of an arrow function. Essentially, your parameter list goes inside here, and right here is your function body. So I can say, for example, console.log10, then I can save this and refresh the browser, then call arrowfunc like this, press enter, and we get 10 right there. Now, if you want to pass in arguments or accept parameters, you can say, for example, a and then comma b. This now has two parameters, a and b. I can then say a plus b, for example. Save this, refresh, call the arrowfunc with the values of 10 and 40, and we expect 50 right there. And essentially, that is how you define and use arrow functions. So now I want to move on to the differences with the this keyword compared to standard JavaScript functions. So to demonstrate this, we're going to be creating a just a standard HTML button. So I can say button with an ID of my BTN. Inside here, we can simply say click me, for example. So now we're going to be adding an event listener to the button, and then we're going to use a standard function for the callback, and then we're going to see how it differs from an arrow function. So we can say const mybtn equal to document.getElementById, of course, pass in here mybtn. Down here we can say mybtn add event listener. For the click event, we're going to run this standard JavaScript function. So we can say function right here, and then we can check the value of the this keyword. So basically, the value of the this keyword is different when it comes to arrow functions and standard functions. So we can say console.log this. I can now save this and refresh the browser, click on the button, and we get here the button itself. So in this case, with standard functions, the this keyword refers to the button. So essentially, the this keyword refers to the objects which actually called the function. In this case, it's going to be the button. Okay? So if I was to change this to an arrow function, for example, parentheses equals greater than, like this, save this and refresh, and now click on the button, we get window. So essentially, in this case with arrow functions, there is no binding of the this keyword, which means this looks for the this keyword the way it would any other variable. So basically it sees this isn't defined in this scope, so it checks the above scope, and this right here is where this is equal to window. So if I was to console.log this up here, of course, we're going to get window. And that is exactly where this arrow function got the this value from. I'm going to save this now and refresh, and we get window for the first console log. If I was to click on it, of course, we get window once again. So that is how the this keyword differentiates between standard functions and arrow functions. I'm going to further explain this with a different example. So let's get rid of all this stuff and define an object. So we can say const myObject is equal to an object. Pretty straightforward. Then we can define a property called bottle, for example. This will be a function. So I can say function like this, then I can say console.log this, okay? I can then say myobj.bottle. In this case, once again, we expect this to be the actual object because we are calling the bottle method on the object itself. So this will be referred to, this will have the value of the the object. So I'm going to save this and refresh, and of course we get the object right there. Now if I was to make this once again the arrow function like this, in this case save this and refresh, and once again we get window. So this time it is seen there is no this in these scopes, so it goes up to the window right here, and that is where it gets the this keyword from. It is no different to defining a variable. For example, let a equal to 50. Okay, if I was to log a inside here, it works the exact same way. A is defined in this scope, so it grabs that a right there. Save this and refresh, and of course we get 50. So that is the difference between this in arrow functions compared to standard JavaScript functions. I hope that makes sense. So now I want to move on to the shorter and more concise syntax. So one of these examples is that arrow functions don't actually need parentheses when using a single parameter. So we can say const, for example, arrow func is equal to, then I can say a, then I can say console.log a. So in this case, obviously we haven't actually specified parentheses around this like this, so it's still going to work. So if I was to save this and refresh and then call the function, for example, we can say 25, press enter, we get 25 right there. So essentially this right here is the exact same as saying this right here. So you can't actually use multiple parameters through, without these parentheses. So I can't say, for example, B and then C. It's not going to work. So for multiple, you need to have the parentheses surrounding the parameter list. Cool. So that is the single parameter right there. I also want to talk about the implicit return value. So for example, if I was to say const arrow func equal to, then I can say a, for example, once again, then I can say a times 5. So in this example, we haven't specified return a times 5, but it's actually going to return this function a times 5. So if I was to save this and refresh, then call arrow func, let's just do 10 times 5, press enter, we get 50 right there. So essentially, doing this right here is the same as saying this, return a times 5. So there's no need for the curly braces or the return keyword. You simply just put the expression right there, and that's going to work the same way. So definitely a lot shorter. And the last thing I want to talk about here is the no arguments object. So with arrow functions, you don't get the arguments object, which means if I was to once again just define arrow func, so I can say const arrow func is equal to, then I can say let's just do simply console.log and pass in here arguments. So in regular functions, you know what, I might actually start with that. So I can just rename this to be func and then make this a regular function like this. Okay, cool. Then I can say, for example, func and say for dom, and let's just put an array for 3 and 9. So in this case, arguments is going to be an argument object containing basically a list of these arguments. So I'm going to save this and refresh, and we get here console.log, the arguments object right here. We get for, dom, and the array. So with arrow functions, the arguments object doesn't actually exist. So if I was to make this an arguments object, if I was to make this an arrow function, save this and refresh, we get here argument is not defined. Alrighty. So how do you get around that? Well, you can actually use what's called REST parameters. So I made a whole separate video on this, but a quick example here will be this. If you put 3 dots like this, then say args args is now an array of your arguments. So if I was to save this and refresh, we now get the array right there. This isn't the arguments object, but it's instead an actual array. Okay, so as I said, I've got a whole video covering the REST parameters. Anyway, that is arrow functions in JavaScript. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you later.